The wagon train had stopped burying people 3 days ago because the ground had become too frozen, and there were simply too many bodies. Winifred Kendall pressed her cracked lips together and pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders as she watched the last family ahead of her disappear into the trading post at the edge of Lincoln, Nebraska. It was December 1876, and she had survived cholera, starvation, and attacks by desperate bandits during the 6-month journey from Philadelphia. But she had nothing left except the clothes on her back, and a body so thin her hip bones jutted through the fabric of her dress. She had turned 21 somewhere on the trail, though she could not remember exactly when. Her parents had died within hours of each other from the sickness, and her younger brother had fallen from the wagon and been crushed beneath the wheels before anyone could stop the oxen. The family that had agreed to take her in after that had abandoned her 2 weeks ago when their own supplies ran too low. She had walked the final 100 miles, eating whatever she could forage and sleeping on the frozen ground with nothing but that single blanket. Now she stood at the edge of civilization, watching smoke rise from chimneys and wondering if she would survive another night in the cold. Her fingers had lost feeling hours ago, and her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth because her shoes had fallen apart 50 miles back. She had never owned much in her life. In Philadelphia, she had shared a narrow bed with her mother and brother in a single room while her father slept on the floor. Before that, when she was a child, she had slept on a pile of straw in the corner of whatever room her family could afford. She had never known what it felt like to have a bed of her own, a space that belonged only to her, soft and warm and safe. The trading post door opened, and a man stepped out into the fading afternoon light. Winifred shrank back instinctively, but he had already seen her. He was the largest human being she had ever encountered, easily 6.5 feet tall with shoulders that seemed almost too broad to fit through a doorway. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing and heavy furs, and even from a distance, she could see the muscles in his arms and chest that spoke of years spent doing hard labor in unforgiving conditions. He stopped walking and stared at her for a long moment. Winifred tried to straighten her spine and look less desperate than she felt, but she knew what he was seeing. A scarecrow of a girl with matted blonde hair, hollow cheeks, and eyes too large for her face. She probably looked like a corpse that had forgotten to lie down. The man walked toward her with purposeful strides. Winifred tensed, ready to run even though she had no strength left for running. But when he stopped a few feet away, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "You need help." It was not a question. Winifred opened her mouth to respond, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I can work. I can earn my keep." "When did you last eat?" she tried to remember. "Yesterday I found some berries. In December, they were dried on the bush." The man's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "Where is your family?" "Dead." He looked at her for another long moment, and Winifred saw something shift in his expression. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the trading post, gesturing for her to follow. She hesitated, every instinct screaming that following strange men led to bad outcomes, but the alternative was freezing to death in the street. She forced her numb feet to move. Inside the trading post, warmth hit her like a physical force. Her knees buckled, and suddenly the man's hand was under her elbow, steadying her with a grip that was firm but careful. He guided her to a chair near the pot-bellied stove and then spoke to the man behind the counter. "Samuel, get me bread, cheese, and some of that soup your wife made. And hot tea." "That is going to cost you, Jeremiah. Put it on my account." The man called Jeremiah pulled another chair close to the stove and sat down, his massive frame making the furniture look like it belonged in a dollhouse. He watched Winifred with an expression she could not quite read. When the food came, he took the bowl of soup and the cup of tea and held them out to her. "Slowly," he said. "Your stomach will not handle much at first." Winifred took the bowl with shaking hands and forced herself to sip the broth carefully, even though every cell in her body screamed at her to gulp it down. The warmth spread through her chest and belly, and she had to blink back tears at how good it felt. Jeremiah watched her eat half the soup and drink some of the tea before he spoke again. "My name is Jeremiah Quinn. I live up in the mountains about 20 miles north of here. I come down every few weeks for supplies." Winifred swallowed another spoonful of soup. "Winifred Kendall." "Where were you headed, Winifred?" "Nowhere specific. My family was going to try farming, but that does not matter now. You have no one." "No one." Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "I have a proposal for you. You need a place to stay, and I could use help with cooking and mending and keeping the cabin in order. The work is not easy, and the mountains are isolated, but you would have food, shelter, and safety. I would pay you wages, and if you decide you want to leave in the spring, I will bring you back to town and help you get settled somewhere." Winifred stared at him. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because I know what it is like to have nothing," Jeremiah said simply. "And because no one should have to sleep on frozen ground when there is a warm bed available." She studied his face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. His eyes were a dark gray, steady and serious. There were lines around them that suggested he spent a lot of time squinting into the sun or wind. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who worked hard for everything he had. She had learned to read people during her 21 years of life, and everything about this man suggested straightforward honesty. "I accept," she said quietly. Jeremiah nodded. "Finish eating. We will get you some warmer clothes and proper boots, and then we will head up the mountain before dark." The next hour passed in a blur. Jeremiah bought her a heavy wool coat, lined gloves, sturdy boots, thick stockings, and 2 woolen dresses that would stand up to mountain winters. He also purchased supplies for himself, loading everything onto a large mule that waited patiently outside. When Winifred tried to thank him, he simply shook his head. "You will earn it all back with your work," he said. "No need for thanks." They set out as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, following a narrow trail that led away from town and into the foothills. Winifred rode the mule while Jeremiah walked beside it, carrying his rifle loosely in one hand. The new boots felt strange on her feet after weeks of makeshift wrappings, and the coat was so warm she almost could not believe it. For the first time in months, she was not shivering. The trail climbed steadily upward, winding through stands of pine trees and across rocky slopes where snow had begun to accumulate. Jeremiah moved with the easy confidence of someone who had walked this path 1,000 times. He did not speak much, but occasionally he would point out a landmark or warn her to watch for a low branch. As darkness fell, Winifred began to see lights flickering in the distance. The cabin came into view gradually, a solid structure built from thick logs with a stone chimney from which smoke was rising. It was larger than she had expected, with a covered porch across the front and shuttered windows that glowed with firelight. "I left the fire burning," Jeremiah explained as he helped her down from the mule. "I knew I would be back before it went out." Inside, the cabin was warm and surprisingly well organized. The main room held a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, shelves lined with supplies and equipment, and a rocking chair near the hearth. A ladder led up to a loft, and there were 2 doors leading to other rooms. The floors were made of smooth planks, and thick furs covered parts of the floor and walls. Everything was clean and well-maintained, not at all what she had expected from a solitary mountain man. Jeremiah began unloading the supplies while Winifred stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, unsure what to do. When he noticed her hesitation, he gestured toward one of the doors. "That is your room," he said. "Mine is up in the loft. Go ahead and look." Winifred crossed to the door and opened it slowly. The room beyond was small but perfect. A bed stood against one wall, and she stopped breathing when she saw it. It was a real bed, not a pile of straw or a thin mattress on the floor, but an actual bed frame with a thick feather mattress, pillows, and layers of quilts and furs. There was a small dresser, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a rag rug on the floor. A lantern hung from a hook on the wall. She walked forward as if in a dream and placed one hand on the mattress. It yielded softly beneath her fingers, promising comfort and warmth. Something broke inside her chest, and before she could stop herself, she was crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body and left her gasping for air. She sank down onto the edge of the bed and buried her face in her hands. She had never had a bed of her own, not once in 21 years. And this stranger, this mountain man who owed her nothing, had given her this. She did not hear Jeremiah enter the room, but suddenly his voice was there, low and concerned. "Are you hurt? Did I do something wrong?" Winifred shook her head violently, unable to form words. She felt his weight settle onto the bed beside her, the mattress dipping under his substantial mass. He did not touch her, but his presence was solid and somehow comforting. "I am sorry," she finally managed to choke out. "I am sorry, I have never had a bed of my own. Never. And it is so soft and she trailed off, knowing she sounded ridiculous. But Jeremiah did not laugh or tell her she was being foolish. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "Then I am glad I could give you one," he said simply. "You sleep as long as you want tonight. There is water in the pitcher if you want to wash, and I will leave some food on the table for when you are ready. But rest first." He stood and walked to the door, then paused and looked back at her. In the lamplight, his expression was gentle in a way that transformed his rugged features. "You are safe here, Winifred. I give you my word." Then he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Winifred sat on the bed for a long time, just feeling the softness beneath her and letting the warmth of the room seep into her bones. Eventually, she washed her face and hands in the basin, marveling at the clean water and the cake of soap that smelled like pine. She undid her tangled hair and tried to work some of the knots out with her fingers. When she finally lay down on the bed, still wearing her new dress because she had nothing else, the mattress embraced her like a gentle cloud. The quilts and furs were heavy and warm, cocooning her in comfort. She could hear Jeremiah moving around in the main room, the sounds of him preparing food and tending the fire. Normal, domestic sounds that spoke of safety and routine. She fell asleep almost instantly, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not dream of death and cold and hunger. When Winifred woke, sunlight was streaming through the shutters, and the cabin was filled with the smell of cooking meat and coffee. She sat up slowly, disoriented for a moment before memory flooded back. The bed, the room, Jeremiah Quinn and his unexpected kindness. She had slept deeply and dreamlessly, and her body felt more rested than it had in months. She got up and straightened her dress as best she could, wishing she had a mirror and a comb. When she opened the door and stepped into the main room, she found Jeremiah standing at the stove, cooking breakfast. He had changed into a clean shirt, and his hair was damp as if he had washed recently. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "There is coffee on the table. Breakfast will be ready soon." Winifred poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down, watching him work. His movements were efficient and practiced, and she realized he had been taking care of himself for a long time. When he set a plate in front of her loaded with eggs, bacon, and biscuits, her stomach growled audibly. "Eat," he said, sitting down across from her with his own plate. "You need to rebuild your strength." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Winifred worked up the courage to speak. "What would you like me to do today?" Jeremiah considered the question. "Today, you rest and recover. Tomorrow, we can talk about the work. You need at least a few days to get your strength back." "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden. You are recovering from nearly dying. There is a difference." His matter-of-fact tone left no room for argument. Winifred ate her breakfast and tried not to feel guilty about accepting his help. After they finished eating, Jeremiah showed her around the cabin more thoroughly. The room she occupied had originally been storage, but he had converted it into a bedroom when he decided to look for help. His own space in the loft was simple and functional, just a bed and a trunk for his belongings. The cabin had a root cellar stocked with preserved foods, a workshop area where he crafted tools and repaired equipment, and even a small bathing room with a copper tub. Outside, there was a barn for the mule and the 2 horses he owned, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and a well with a pump. "I built most of it myself over the past 8 years, Jeremiah explained as they walked the perimeter. "I trap and hunt, sell the furs and meat in town. It is a good living and I like the solitude." "Then why did you want help?" Winifred asked. Jeremiah was quiet for a moment, his breath frosting in the cold air. "I am tired of coming home to an empty cabin, and I am not as young as I used to be. 32 is not old, but it is old enough to start thinking about the future." They spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship. Jeremiah worked on repairing some traps while Winifred sat by the fire and finally used a proper comb to work through her tangled hair. He had provided her with basic toiletries and personal items, everything she might need, and she was overwhelmed again by his thoughtfulness. That night, when she went to bed, she found the mattress had been fluffed and the blankets had been rearranged to provide even more warmth. She realized Jeremiah must have done it while she was outside using the privy. The gesture touched her deeply, and she fell asleep thinking about the strange mountain man who seemed determined to make sure she was comfortable. The pattern repeated itself over the next few days. Each morning, Winifred would wake to find the cabin warm and breakfast cooking. Each night, she would discover small improvements to her room. More furs added to the bed, a small cushion for the chair, a book placed on the dresser for her to read. Jeremiah never mentioned these additions, but she knew they came from him. On the 4th day, she declared herself ready to work. Jeremiah assigned her the easier tasks to start: cooking, washing dishes, mending his clothes, and organizing supplies. Winifred threw herself into the work with determination, wanting to prove her worth. She had learned basic domestic skills from her mother, and she was a quick learner for anything she did not know. Jeremiah spent his days checking trap lines, hunting, and maintaining the property. He would leave early in the morning and return in the afternoon, always bringing back game or checking that everything was secure for winter. He was a man of few words, but Winifred began to notice the small ways he communicated. A nod of approval when she made a particularly good meal. A slight smile when she successfully completed a difficult mending job. The way he always made sure she had the chair closest to the fire. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, a winter storm rolled in with frightening speed. The wind howled around the cabin, and snow began to fall so heavily that Winifred could not see the barn from the window. Jeremiah spent an hour making sure all the animals were secure, and that the cabin was properly shuttered before he came inside, covered in snow and breathing hard from exertion. "That is going to be a bad one," he said, shaking snow from his coat. "We might be stuck inside for a few days." Winifred had dinner ready, a hearty stew made from venison and root vegetables. They ate while the wind screamed outside, and she tried not to show how nervous the storm made her. She had seen people die in weather like this on the wagon train. But the cabin was solid and warm, and she felt safe here in a way she had never felt anywhere else. After dinner, Jeremiah built up the fire and settled into his rocking chair with a piece of wood and a carving knife. Winifred watched as his large, scarred hands moved with surprising delicacy, shaping the wood into something beautiful. She sat in the other chair, working on mending one of his shirts, and they fell into a comfortable silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. "Can I ask you something?" Winifred said after a while. "Of course. Why do you live up here alone? You could have a much easier life in town." Jeremiah did not answer right away. His knife continued to move across the wood, shaving off thin curls that fell to the floor. Finally, he spoke. "I was a soldier during the war, Union Army. I saw things and did things that made it hard to be around people afterward. I tried living in town when I first came west, but it felt wrong. Too many people, too much noise, too many memories. Up here, the silence is clean. It does not ask questions or expect anything from me." Winifred thought about that. "Do you ever get lonely?" "Sometimes, but lonely is better than." He trailed off, then shook his head. "I've gotten used to my own company." "And now you have me disrupting your peace," Winifred said with a small smile. Jeremiah looked up at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You do not disrupt anything. You make the cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep." The moment hung between them, charged with something Winifred could not quite name. Then Jeremiah looked back down at his carving, and the spell was broken. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, Winifred and Jeremiah were trapped inside together, and the forced proximity revealed things about each other that might have taken months to discover otherwise. Winifred learned that Jeremiah had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, that he was surprisingly well-read and owned a small collection of books that he had accumulated over the years, that he had a beautiful singing voice that he was shy about using. Jeremiah learned that Winifred was fiercely intelligent despite her limited education, that she had a talent for drawing and would sketch on spare bits of paper when she thought he was not looking, that she had a deep well of courage that had kept her alive through circumstances that would have broken many people. On the 3rd night of the storm, Winifred woke to the sound of shouting. She lay in her warm bed for a moment, confused, before she realized the sound was coming from the loft. Jeremiah was having a nightmare. She could hear him thrashing around, his voice raw with terror as he shouted warnings about enemy positions and falling soldiers. She got up and climbed the ladder to the loft without thinking. In the dim light from the banked fire below, she could see Jeremiah tangled in his blankets, his face contorted with anguish. She approached carefully and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jeremiah, wake up. You are safe. You are home." He came awake with a gasp, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist before he fully recognized her. For a moment, his eyes were wild and unfocused. Then reality reasserted itself, and he released her immediately, breathing hard. "I am sorry," he said roughly. "Did I hurt you?" "No." "You were having a nightmare." Jeremiah scrubbed his hands over his face. "They come sometimes. I am sorry I woke you. Do not apologize. We all have nightmares." She sat down on the edge of his bed without thinking about propriety or what it meant. In the darkness of the loft, with the storm still raging outside, they were just two people who had seen too much of the darkness in the world. "The war?" she asked softly. "Always the war." Jeremiah leaned back against the wall, his massive frame seeming somehow diminished. I can go months without dreaming about it, and then something will trigger it and I am back there again. My nightmares are about the wagon train, Winifred said. Watching people die and not being able to help them. Being so hungry I thought about eating grass. The cold. They sat together in the darkness, sharing their pain without judgment. Eventually, Jeremiah's breathing evened out and some of the tension left his shoulders. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for waking me. Anytime." Winifred climbed back down the ladder and returned to her own bed, but something had shifted between them. They had seen each other's vulnerabilities now, and instead of driving them apart, it had created a bond. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, the world outside was transformed. Snow had drifted as high as the cabin's windows in some places, and everything was covered in a blanket of pristine white. Jeremiah spent the day digging out paths to the barn and other outbuildings while Winifred kept the fire going and prepared food. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Jeremiah pulled out the piece of wood he had been carving during the storm. He turned it over in his large hands, examining it critically, then held it out to Winifred. "I made this for you." She took it carefully and gasped. He had carved a perfect replica of a cardinal in flight, every feather detailed and precise. The bird seemed almost alive in her hands, caught in a moment of grace and freedom. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Why a cardinal? They are survivors. They stay here all winter when other birds flee south. They find a way to thrive even in the harshest conditions. It reminded me of you." Winifred looked up at him, and the expression on his face made her heart skip. There was admiration there, and something deeper that she was almost afraid to name. She realized with a start that she had been falling in love with this quiet, gentle giant of a man, and that the feeling might be mutual. "Thank you," she said, clutching the carving to her chest. "I will treasure it always." As winter deepened, life in the cabin settled into a rhythm. Winifred's body slowly recovered from the ordeal of the wagon train. She gained weight, her hollow cheeks filling out and her bones becoming less prominent. Her hair regained its shine, and color returned to her face. She felt herself becoming strong again, both physically and mentally. Jeremiah continued to show his care in small, constant ways. He made sure the cabin was always warm before she woke. He brought her small gifts from his trips into town: a new book, a packet of tea, ribbons for her hair. He taught her how to shoot so she could protect herself when he was away checking trap lines. He never touched her inappropriately or made her feel unsafe, but the air between them was charged with growing attraction. One afternoon in late January, Winifred was kneading bread dough when Jeremiah came in from outside, his face set in grim lines. "There is a group of men camped about 5 miles south of here," he said without preamble. "I saw their smoke when I was checking the north line. They look like drifters and they are too close for comfort." Winifred felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What do we do?" "Stay alert. Keep the rifle loaded. If anyone comes to the door while I am out, do not open it unless you know who it is." He paused. "I am going to be working closer to the cabin for the next few days. I do not like the look of them." The danger that Jeremiah had warned about materialized 2 days later. Winifred was alone in the cabin, baking and humming to herself, when she heard horses approaching. She grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the shutters. 3 men on horseback were riding up to the cabin. They were rough-looking, with long coats and the hard faces of men who lived outside the law. Winifred's heart hammered in her chest as one of them dismounted and approached the door. "Hello in the cabin," he called out. "We saw your smoke and thought we would be neighborly." Winifred said nothing. Jeremiah had told her not to open the door and she would not. "Come on now, we know someone is in there. We just want to talk." Still, she remained silent. The man tried the door handle and found it locked. His voice turned ugly. "Listen here, whoever you are. We have been in the mountains for 2 months with no supplies. We need food and we need it now. You can give it to us friendly-like or we can take it." Winifred backed away from the door, the rifle clutched in her hands. She had never shot at a person before, and the thought terrified her. But she would not let them into the cabin. She would not let them destroy the sanctuary that Jeremiah had created. The man started to say something else, but suddenly there was a shout from one of the mounted men. "Someone is coming." Winifred heard it too, the sound of a horse being ridden hard. She risked another look out the window and saw Jeremiah approaching at a gallop, his rifle in his hands. Even from a distance, he looked enormous and dangerous. The 3 men scrambled for their horses as Jeremiah pulled up in front of the cabin. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his rifle trained on the men with steady hands. "Get off my property," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing with absolute authority. "We were just being friendly," one of the men said, trying for a placating tone. "I know who you are. I saw your wanted posters in Lincoln. You are the gang that has been robbing homesteads down south. Now get moving before I decide to collect the reward." The men looked at each other, clearly trying to calculate their odds. They were 3 to his 1, but Jeremiah stood like an immovable mountain, his rifle never wavering. Whatever they saw in his face convinced them not to risk it. They turned their horses and rode off at speed, disappearing into the trees. Jeremiah watched them go, then finally lowered his rifle. He turned to the cabin. "Winifred, you can open the door now." She fumbled with the lock and threw the door open, and before she could think about what she was doing, she ran to him and threw her arms around his waist. He was so solid, so warm, so alive. She had been terrified that they would hurt him. "I am all right," Jeremiah said softly, one of his large hands coming up to rest gently on her back. "You did exactly right by not opening the door." "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice muffled against his chest. "I know. I am sorry I left you alone. I should have known they might come up here." Winifred pulled back just enough to look up at him. "You protected me. You keep me safe." Something flickered in Jeremiah's eyes. His hand moved from her back to cup her face, his calloused thumb brushing across her cheek with incredible gentleness. "I will always keep you safe, Winifred, for as long as you will let me." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Then Jeremiah seemed to catch himself and he stepped back, his hand falling away from her face. "We should go inside," he said gruffly. "I need to load some extra ammunition in case they come back." But something had changed between them again, and they both knew it. The attraction that had been building for weeks was now impossible to ignore. That night, Winifred lay in her soft, warm bed and thought about Jeremiah. She thought about his strength and his gentleness, the way he had given her safety and comfort when she had nothing. She thought about how her heart beat faster when he entered a room, and how she found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking. She thought about the way his hand had felt on her face, and how much she had wanted him to kiss her. She was falling in love with him, and she was almost certain he felt the same way. But neither of them had spoken the words, and she did not know how to bridge that gap. The answer came a week later in the form of another storm. This one was not as fierce as the earlier blizzard, but it was steady and relentless. Jeremiah came in from checking the animals looking exhausted, his face drawn with pain. "What is wrong?" Winifred asked immediately. "Nothing. Just my old war wound acting up. It does that in wet weather. Let me help." "There is nothing you can do," but Winifred was already moving toward him. "Where is the pain?" Jeremiah hesitated, then touched his left shoulder. "I took a bullet here at Shiloh. They got it out, but it left damage." Sometimes the scar tissue tightens up. "Sit down," Winifred ordered, using the same tone her mother had used when tending sick neighbors. "Take off your shirt." Jeremiah's eyebrows rose, but he obeyed. He pulled off his shirt, revealing a torso that was a map of muscle and old scars. Winifred tried not to stare at the sheer physical power evident in his body, but it was difficult. He was built like the mountain he lived on, all solid strength and endurance. She focused on the scar on his shoulder, a puckered circle of tissue that looked painful. She placed her hands on the surrounding muscles and began to knead gently, working the tension out. Jeremiah made a sound that was half groan, half sigh. "That helps," he admitted. Winifred continued to work, her hands moving over his shoulder and back. The intimacy of the moment was not lost on either of them. She could feel the heat of his skin, the way his muscles moved beneath her fingers. She could hear his breathing, steady and deep. When she finished, Jeremiah turned to look at her. They were very close, her hands still resting on his bare shoulders. The firelight played across his features, making his eyes look almost silver. "Winifred," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "I am falling in love with you. I think I have been since the moment I saw you in Lincoln, looking like you were too stubborn to die. I know I should not say this. You work for me and you depend on me, and it is not fair to put this on you. But I cannot keep pretending I do not feel it." Winifred's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "What if I feel the same way?" Jeremiah's eyes widened. "Do you?" "Yes. I love you, Jeremiah. You saved my life, and then you gave me so much more than just survival. You gave me a home. You made sure I had a soft, warm bed of my own for the first time in my life. You made me feel valuable and safe. How could I not love you?" Jeremiah reached up and took one of her hands in his, dwarfing it completely. "I never thought I would want someone in my life. After the war, I thought I was too damaged, too broken, but you make me want things I had given up on. A future, a family, someone to share this life with." "I want those things too," Winifred whispered. Jeremiah stood slowly, bringing her up with him. He cupped her face in both of his hands, tilting her head back so he could look into her eyes. "Can I kiss you, please?" He lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers, and Winifred felt like she had been struck by lightning. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was afraid of breaking her. But when she responded, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer, it deepened. His arms came around her, lifting her off her feet, and she felt the full strength of him surrounding her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jeremiah rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, but I am certain. I want you as my wife, Winifred. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are here. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you have everything you need. I want to grow old with you in this cabin and watch the seasons change together." Tears spilled down Winifred's cheeks. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Jeremiah kissed her again, and this time it was full of joy and promise. When he finally set her down, his face was transformed by the biggest smile she had ever seen from him. "I am going to take such good care of you," he promised. "I am going to make you so happy." "You already do," Winifred said, smiling through her tears. "Every single day." They were married 3 weeks later in Lincoln by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. Samuel from the trading post and his wife served as witnesses. Winifred wore a new dress that Jeremiah had commissioned from the town seamstress. A simple but beautiful creation in deep blue wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Jeremiah wore a new shirt and had trimmed his beard, though Winifred had asked him not to cut it too short. She liked the way it looked, liked the way it felt when he kissed her. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jeremiah lifted her off her feet and spun her around while Samuel and his wife laughed and applauded. The ride back up the mountain felt different this time. Winifred was no longer an employee or a guest. She was Jeremiah's wife, going home to their cabin. When they arrived, Jeremiah insisted on carrying her over the threshold, and she laughed at the seriousness with which he performed the tradition. That night, Winifred finally understood what it meant to be truly loved. Jeremiah was gentle and patient, treating her like she was made of precious glass even as his passion burned between them. He worshipped her body with his hands and mouth, showing her pleasures she had never imagined. And when they finally came together, it felt like the last piece of her life clicking into place. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in his bed in the loft, Jeremiah traced idle patterns on her shoulder. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Winifred said honestly. "I keep thinking about that girl standing in Lincoln, freezing and starving and certain she was going to die. If I could go back and tell her what would happen, she would never believe it. I keep thinking about how close I came to not going into town that day," Jeremiah said. "I almost decided to wait another week. If I had, I never would have met you. But you did, and here we are." "Here we are," Jeremiah agreed, pulling her closer. "My wife, my husband." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Winifred had never felt so safe or warm or loved. The rest of that winter passed in a haze of happiness. Winifred and Jeremiah learned each other's rhythms, the give and take of married life. They learned how to work together, how to compromise, how to support each other through difficult days. Jeremiah taught Winifred how to track animals and read weather signs. She taught him some of the songs her mother had sung to her as a child. At night, they would lie in bed and talk about their pasts, sharing stories and memories. Jeremiah told her about growing up on a farm in Ohio, about how the war had destroyed his faith in humanity until he found the mountains. Winifred told him about Philadelphia, about the poverty that had driven her family west in search of something better. "I wish your parents could have known this happiness," Jeremiah said one night. "They would have wanted that for you." "I think they would have liked you," Winifred said. "My father would have appreciated your work ethic. My mother would have loved how gentle you are." "I am only gentle with you," Jeremiah admitted. "With everyone else I am. Terrifying," Winifred suggested with a grin. "I was going to say reserved, but terrifying works too." They laughed together, the sound filling the cabin with warmth. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it transformed everything. The snow melted, revealing green grass and wildflowers. The animals emerged from their winter dens, and the forest came alive with sound and movement. Jeremiah and Winifred spent long days working outside, tending the garden they had planted and making repairs to the buildings. One afternoon in early May, Winifred was weeding the garden when a wave of nausea hit her so suddenly she had to sit down. She pressed a hand to her stomach, breathing carefully until the sensation passed. It was not the first time she had felt sick recently, and a suspicion was beginning to form in her mind. When Jeremiah came home that evening, she told him. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, and then fierce determination. "Are you certain?" "Not completely, but fairly certain. I have missed my courses and I have been sick in the mornings." Jeremiah crossed to her and knelt down, placing his large hands gently on her still flat stomach. "A baby, our baby. Are you happy about it?" Happy does not begin to cover it. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with emotion. "I am terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. You are giving me a family, Winifred. You are giving me everything I never knew I wanted." Jeremiah became even more protective as the pregnancy progressed. He insisted that Winifred rest more and do less heavy work. He made sure she had the most nutritious food and the most comfortable place to sit. He read everything he could find about childbirth and infant care, wanting to be prepared. As Winifred's belly grew, Jeremiah would spend hours with his hands on it, feeling the baby move and kick. He talked to the unborn child, telling it stories about the mountains and promising to teach it everything he knew. In late September, when the leaves were turning gold and red, Winifred went into labor. Jeremiah had brought a midwife up from Lincoln a week earlier, an experienced woman named Mrs. Palmer, who had delivered dozens of babies. But when the contractions started in earnest, Jeremiah looked more terrified than Winifred had ever seen him. "What if something goes wrong?" he asked Mrs. Palmer desperately. "What if I lose her?" "You are not going to lose her," the midwife said firmly. "Your wife is young and strong. But you need to keep yourself together for her sake." Jeremiah took a deep breath and nodded. He stayed by Winifred's side through the long hours of labor, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. When she screamed from the pain, he looked like he wanted to take it from her. When she cried, he wiped her tears with gentle hands. Finally, after nearly 18 hours, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry, his face red and his fists waving. Mrs. Palmer cleaned him up and wrapped him in a soft blanket before placing him in Winifred's arms. "He is perfect," Winifred whispered, staring down at the tiny face. Jeremiah sat on the bed beside her, one arm around her shoulders, looking at his son with an expression of absolute wonder. "He has your nose. He has your chin. What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months, and finally, Winifred said, "James, after my father, James Quinn." "James," Jeremiah repeated, testing the name. He reached out with one large finger and touched his son's tiny hand. James immediately wrapped his fingers around Jeremiah's finger, holding on tight. "Hello, James. Welcome to the world." Over the next few months, their lives revolved around the baby. James was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still demanded constant attention. Jeremiah proved to be a devoted father, taking on night feedings and diaper changes without complaint. He would walk around the cabin with James on his shoulder, singing softly while the baby slept. Winifred had never seen him so happy. The last shadows of the war seemed to fade from his eyes as he focused on his new family. He was building something here, creating a legacy of love instead of violence. When James was 6 months old, they made their first trip as a family down to Lincoln. The townspeople, who remembered the half-starved girl Jeremiah had brought up the mountain, barely recognized the healthy, glowing woman who rode into town with a baby in her arms and her husband by her side. Samuel came out of the trading post and grinned at them. "Well now, look at this. The mountain hermit is a family man." "Times change," Jeremiah said, but he was smiling. They bought supplies and visited with people, and Winifred was struck by how different everything felt. A year and a half ago, she had stood in this town with nothing but despair. Now she had everything. As they rode back up the mountain that evening, James asleep in a sling against Winifred's chest, she looked over at her husband. "Are you happy, Jeremiah? Truly happy?" He reached over and took her hand. "I did not know it was possible to be this happy. You and James are everything to me. You are everything to us too." Life continued its rhythm through the seasons. James grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. He learned to walk holding onto Jeremiah's fingers, taking hesitant steps across the cabin floor while both parents watched with pride. He learned to talk, calling Jeremiah Papa and Winifred Mama in a high, clear voice that made them both melt. When James was 2, Winifred became pregnant again. This time, she recognized the signs immediately. Jeremiah was just as attentive as he had been the first time, but less panicked. They had done this before, and they knew they could do it again. Their daughter was born on a warm spring day in 1879, coming into the world much faster than her brother had. She had Winifred's blonde hair and Jeremiah's gray eyes, and she was perfect. They named her Sarah, after Jeremiah's mother. James was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to touch her and help take care of her. Jeremiah built a larger bed for James so that the cradle could be passed down to Sarah. The cabin rang with the sounds of children now, laughter and crying and the constant noise of young life. Winifred sometimes stood in the doorway of her room, the room that had been given to her that first night, and marveled at how much had changed. The bed was still there, still soft and warm, though she rarely slept in it anymore. She shared Jeremiah's bed in the loft now, their bodies entwined each night. But that room represented something important to her. It represented the moment her life had changed, the moment someone had seen her as worthy of care and comfort. She kept it clean and ready, and sometimes when she needed a moment of quiet, she would sit on that bed and remember the girl who had cried tears of gratitude over having a space of her own. The years passed quickly, filled with the business of raising children and maintaining their mountain home. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved to follow his father around and learn everything he could about tracking and hunting. Sarah was more outgoing, always singing and dancing around the cabin, bringing light and laughter wherever she went. Jeremiah added onto the cabin as the children grew, building more rooms and expanding the living space. He built a larger barn and acquired more animals. The little homestead became more prosperous each year, and Jeremiah's reputation as a reliable source of quality furs and meat meant he always had buyers in town. But no matter how busy life became, he never forgot to make sure Winifred's needs were met. He still brought her small gifts when he went to town. He still made sure the cabin was warm before she woke. He still looked at her with the same wonder he had shown that first day in Lincoln, as if he could not quite believe his luck. One evening, when James was 8 and Sarah was 6, the family sat around the dinner table talking about their days. James was excited about a deer he had tracked with his father, and Sarah was chattering about the kitten that had been born in the barn. Winifred watched her family and felt her heart swell with love. After the children were in bed, she and Jeremiah sat by the fire as they always did. He was carving again, this time making a set of toy horses for Sarah. Winifred was mending, though her thoughts were far away. "What are you thinking about?" Jeremiah asked, noticing her distraction. "How different my life could have been if you had not gone into town that day, if you had not seen me, if you had not cared." Jeremiah set down his carving and reached for her hand. "I think about that too sometimes. How empty my life was before you. I thought I was content with my solitude, but I was just existing. You taught me how to live again. You saved me, Jeremiah. In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "You gave me purpose and joy. You gave me a reason to build a future instead of just surviving day to day." Winifred leaned against his shoulder, fitting perfectly against his side despite their size difference. "I love you so much. I love you too, more than I have words to express." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire. Then Winifred said quietly, "Do you remember what you promised me, that first night?" "I promised you a lot of things that first night. You said you would make sure I had a soft, warm bed, that I would be safe." "And have I kept that promise?" "Every single day," Winifred said. "Every single night. You have given me more than just a bed of my own. You have given me a life of my own, a family of my own, love of my own, everything I never knew I could have." Jeremiah pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You deserve all of it and more. You deserve everything good in this world." "I have everything good right here," Winifred said. "In this cabin with you and our children, I have everything I will ever need." The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, illnesses and injuries, moments of fear and frustration. But through it all, Jeremiah and Winifred faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. James grew into a tall, strong young man who inherited his father's size and quiet strength. Sarah became a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace and her father's determination. Both children knew they were loved, knew they were safe, and grew up with a security that neither of their parents had known in their own childhoods. When James was 20 and Sarah was 18, they both left the mountain to pursue their own lives. James married a girl from Lincoln and started his own homestead nearby. Sarah went to Denver to become a teacher, something she had dreamed about for years. Jeremiah and Winifred helped them prepare for their new lives with full hearts, knowing they had raised good, capable people who would make their mark on the world. Alone again in the cabin, Winifred and Jeremiah rediscovered the quiet intimacy they had shared in the early days of their marriage. They were older now, both in their 40s, with gray threading through their hair and lines on their faces. But the love between them had not diminished. If anything, it had grown richer and more complex, seasoned by years of shared experiences and mutual support. One autumn evening, exactly 20 years after Winifred had stood freezing in Lincoln, they sat together on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and smoke from their chimney rose straight into the still air. 20 years, Winifred said softly. "Has it really been 20 years? It has gone so fast," Jeremiah agreed. "Seems like just yesterday I was carrying you over that threshold for the first time. We have had a good life, haven't we? The best life I could have imagined." Winifred looked at her husband, this man who had saved her and loved her and built a world with her. His hair was more gray than brown now, and his beard was shot through with white. There were deeper lines around his eyes, and his hands were more gnarled from years of hard work. But he was still her mountain man, still strong and protective, still capable of making her feel safe with just his presence. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me that day, for not looking away, for giving me a chance at life when I thought I had none left." Jeremiah turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his. "Winifred, you have thanked me 100 times over the years, and every time I tell you the same thing. You do not owe me thanks. You gave me just as much as I gave you. More, maybe. You gave me love and family and purpose. You made me whole again after the war tried to break me. We saved each other." "But the bed," Winifred said, smiling through sudden tears. "You made sure I had a soft, warm bed when I had never had one before. That one act of kindness changed my entire life. And loving you has been the greatest privilege of mine," Jeremiah said. He stood and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her in the way he had done 1,000 times before. She fit against him perfectly, her head resting against his chest where she could hear his steady heartbeat. They stood like that as the sun finished setting and the stars began to appear overhead. The mountain was quiet around them, the peaceful silence that had drawn Jeremiah here all those years ago. But it was no longer a lonely silence. It was filled with love and memories and the promise of more years to come. Eventually, they went inside to the cabin that had been their home for 2 decades. Jeremiah banked the fire while Winifred lit the lamps. They moved around each other with the ease of long practice, each knowing where the other would be and what they needed. When they climbed up to the loft and lay down together in their bed, Winifred thought about that first night when she had cried tears of gratitude over having a room of her own. She had been so young then, so desperate and broken. That girl could never have imagined the life she would build with the mountain man who had taken pity on her. But Jeremiah had seen something in her that day, had recognized a kindred spirit who needed saving. And in saving her, he had saved himself. They had built something beautiful together in these mountains, something that would last long after they were gone. "I love you, Jeremiah Quinn," Winifred whispered into the darkness. "I love you, Winifred Quinn," he whispered back, pulling her close against him. And as they drifted off to sleep, warm and safe and together, Winifred thought about beds. She had spent the first 21 years of her life never having one of her own. And then this man, this beautiful, gentle giant of a man, had made sure she had not just a bed but a home. Not just warmth but love. Not just safety but a future filled with joy. She had never slept in a bed of her own before that cold December night in 1876. But for the past 20 years, Jeremiah had made sure her bed was soft and warm every single night. And it would remain that way for all the years to come, because they had each other, and that was everything that mattered. The years that followed were golden ones for Jeremiah and Winifred. They watched their children build their own families and start their own traditions. James and his wife had 3 children, giving Jeremiah and Winifred their first grandchildren. Sarah married a doctor in Denver and had 2 daughters who inherited her love of learning and her grandmother's green eyes. The cabin in the mountains became a gathering place for the growing family. Every summer, they would all make the journey up the mountain for a week together. The adults would sit on the porch and talk while the grandchildren ran wild through the forest, exploring with the same wonder that their parents had shown at that age. Jeremiah, now well into his 50s, still had the strength and vitality that had characterized his younger years, though he moved a bit more slowly and needed more rest. He taught his grandchildren how to track animals, how to read the signs of changing weather, how to survive in the wilderness. They adored their grandfather, this towering man with the gentle voice who could lift 3 of them at once, and who carved them toys from pieces of wood. Winifred bloomed in her role as grandmother. She taught her granddaughters how to cook and sew, shared stories of the old days, and dispensed wisdom earned from decades of living. But she also made sure to tell them about strength and survival, about how she had walked the final 100 miles of the wagon train on wrapped feet, and how she had learned to shoot a rifle and defend her home. She wanted them to know that women could be both gentle and fierce, both nurturing and strong. One winter evening, when it was just the 2 of them again, Jeremiah was working on reinforcing the chicken coop while Winifred prepared dinner. She watched him through the window, this man who had been her whole world for so many years. He moved with purpose, his large frame still solid and capable despite his age. When he came in, stamping snow from his boots, she had hot coffee waiting for him. He wrapped his cold hands around the cup and gave her the smile that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "Getting colder," he observed. "Going to be a hard winter. We have survived hard winters before. That we have." He took a sip of coffee. "I was thinking today about the first winter you were here. How scared I was that I would not be able to take care of you properly. You took perfect care of me. You were so thin, like a ghost. I kept worrying you would just disappear." Winifred crossed to him and cupped his bearded face in her hands. "I am still here, solid and real and yours." "Mine," he agreed and kissed her. They ate dinner together, talking about their plans for the spring. James wanted to expand his homestead and had asked for Jeremiah's advice. Sarah was pregnant with her 3rd child and would not be able to visit until summer. The conversation was ordinary and domestic, but it was threaded through with the deep contentment that came from a life well lived. That night as they lay in bed, Winifred ran her fingers through Jeremiah's now mostly white hair. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Bringing me here, taking on the responsibility of me." Jeremiah caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Not for a single second. You were the best decision I ever made. Even though I disrupted your solitude, especially because you disrupted my solitude, I needed disrupting. I needed saving, Winifred, just as much as you did. Maybe more." They fell asleep holding each other as they always had, as they always would. The seasons turned, bringing them to their 30th anniversary. James and Sarah organized a celebration, gathering the entire family at the cabin for a party. The children had arranged for a photographer to come up from Lincoln, a new luxury that would have been unthinkable in the early days of their marriage. The photograph captured them all, Jeremiah and Winifred in the center, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Jeremiah stood with his hand on Winifred's shoulder, tall and solid despite his 57 years. Winifred sat in a chair in front of him, her face still beautiful at 51, her eyes bright with joy. Around them, 3 generations of the family they had created together. After the party, when everyone had left and it was just the two of them again, Winifred looked at the photograph for a long time. "I wish that girl in Lincoln could see this," she said quietly. "The one who thought she was going to die alone in the cold. I wish she could know what was waiting for her." "I wish the boy who went to war could see it," Jeremiah replied. "The one who thought he would never feel anything but pain and regret again. I wish he could know that healing was possible." They looked at each other, these two people who had saved each other all those years ago, and smiled. More years passed, bringing both joy and sorrow. They lost friends to age and illness. Jeremiah's old war wound acted up more frequently, leaving him in pain during the cold months. Winifred developed arthritis in her hands, making the fine work she loved more difficult. But they faced each challenge together, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating the good ones. Their grandchildren grew into adults and started families of their own, making Jeremiah and Winifred great-grandparents. The family tree that had started with 2 desperate, damaged people now spread wide, encompassing dozens of lives that would not have existed without that chance meeting in Lincoln. When Jeremiah was 65 and Winifred was 59, they made a decision. They would leave the mountain cabin to James and his family and move to a smaller house in Lincoln. Jeremiah's body could no longer handle the harsh mountain winters, and they both needed to be closer to doctors and family as they aged. The day they left the cabin was bittersweet. Winifred walked through each room one last time, touching the walls and remembering. Here was where she had cooked thousands of meals. Here was where her children had played. Here was the room that had been hers first, the room with the soft bed that had changed her life. Jeremiah found her there, standing in the doorway with tears on her face. "I know this is hard," he said gently. "This has been our home for 34 years. "I am not sad," Winifred said, wiping her eyes. "Or maybe I am, but I am happy too. We built something beautiful here, Jeremiah. We raised our children and loved each other and survived everything the mountains could throw at us. And now we are passing it on to the next generation. I am proud of us," Jeremiah said, "of what we created. So am I." They locked the cabin door behind them and made the journey down to Lincoln for the last time as mountain dwellers. But the love they had built in those mountains went with them, as solid and enduring as the peaks themselves. The house in Lincoln was smaller and more modern, with a cast iron stove and glass windows and neighbors close by. It took some adjusting, but they made it home. Jeremiah spent his days working in the garden and visiting with old friends. Winifred joined a quilting circle and helped Sarah teach at the local school. But every evening, they would sit together on their porch and watch the sun set over the mountains in the distance. And every night, they would lie down together in their bed, Jeremiah making sure it was soft and warm, just as he had promised all those years ago when Jeremiah was 72 and Winifred was 66. His heart finally gave out. It happened peacefully in his sleep, with Winifred beside him. She woke to find him gone, his face peaceful and his hand still holding hers. The grief was overwhelming, but so was the gratitude. They had been married for 45 years, and every one of those years had been filled with love. She had been blessed beyond measure, and she knew it. At the funeral, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to honor the man who had been the foundation of their family. Story after story was shared about his kindness, his strength, his quiet wisdom. Winifred listened to it all and thought about the scared soldier who had hidden in the mountains, trying to outrun his demons. If only he could see what his life had become, how many people he had touched, how much love he had created. After Jeremiah died, Winifred moved in with Sarah and her family in Denver. She lived for another 8 years, surrounded by people who loved her and cared for her. She spent those years writing down the story of her life, wanting future generations to know where they had come from. She wrote about Philadelphia and the wagon train, about starvation and cold and loss. She wrote about standing in Lincoln with nothing but despair, and about the mountain man who had seen her and offered help. She wrote about the bed that had been hers, the first soft, warm place she had ever known. She wrote about falling in love and building a life and raising a family in the mountains. And she wrote about Jeremiah, trying to capture in words what he had meant to her. His strength and gentleness, his protection and support, his unwavering love that had sustained her through decades of life. She wanted everyone to know what an extraordinary man he had been, how he had saved her in every way that mattered. When Winifred finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 74, she was buried beside Jeremiah in the Lincoln Cemetery. The service was attended by more than 100 people, all of them connected to the family that had started with 2 damaged souls finding each other on a cold December day. The cabin in the mountains remained in the Quinn family, passed down through generations. James's children inherited it from him, and their children after that. It became a family landmark, a place where everyone gathered to remember their roots and honor the people who had started it all. And in every generation, someone would tell the story of Winifred and Jeremiah. The girl who had never slept in a bed of her own, and the mountain man who made sure hers was soft and warm every night. The 2 people who had saved each other and built a legacy of love that would last for generations. The carved cardinal that Jeremiah had made for Winifred during that first winter was displayed in a place of honor in the cabin, a reminder of survival and hope. The photograph from their 30th anniversary hung on the wall, showing the family they had created together. And in the room that had once been Winifred's, the bed remained, carefully maintained and passed down, a symbol of the kindness that had changed everything. Their love story became part of family legend, told and retold with each new generation. Children would ask to hear about great-great-grandma Winifred, who walked 100 miles on wrapped feet, and great-great-grandpa Jeremiah, who was so big he could lift 3 kids at once. Teenagers would roll their eyes at the romance, but secretly hope to find love like that themselves. Adults would tell the story to their own children and remember what was truly important in life. And somewhere in the mountains of Nebraska, the wind would blow through the pines and the seasons would turn, and the love that Winifred and Jeremiah had shared would endure, as permanent and unchanging as the landscape itself. They had created something beautiful together, something that death could not diminish or time erase. They had given each other everything, and in doing so, they had given their descendants a foundation built on love, kindness, and the simple act of seeing another person's pain and choosing to help. The girl who had never had a bed of her own had ended up with not just a bed, but a home, a family, and a love that would echo through time. And the mountain man who had thought himself too broken for happiness had discovered that healing comes through loving and being loved, through choosing connection over isolation, through making sure that those we care about are safe and warm and cherished. Their story was proof that even in the hardest circumstances, even when everything seems lost, love can find a way. That one act of kindness can change the course of a life. That two damaged people can heal each other and build something lasting and good. And that sometimes, the most important thing you can give someone is not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but simply the assurance that they matter, that they are worthy of care, that they deserve a soft, warm place to rest at the end of each day. Winifred had never slept in a bed of her own before Jeremiah Quinn, but he had made sure hers was soft and warm every night for 45 years, and the love behind that simple act had created a legacy that would never fade.